Welcome to the Software People Stories. I'm Shiv.
I'm Chitra,
And I'm Gayatri.
We bring you interesting, untold stories of people.
associated with the creation
Or consumption of software-based solutions.
You'll hear stories of what worked.
and sometimes what didn't,
You will also hear very personal experiences.
and insights that would trigger your thoughts.
And inspire you to do even greater things.
Ever had this experience with your parents? Your dad or mum walking into the room while you were studying, and you had music plugged into your ears or blaring all around, and that helped you study. I'm sure your parent thought otherwise. This is among many interesting stories that were revealed in conversation with Deepak Visveswaraiah, Vice President of Platform Engineering at Pega Systems, and our guest in this episode of the Software People Stories. From cutting his teeth in hardcore engineering fundamentals of attention to detail, quality, and work ethics, while working at a place where you absolutely had to have your eyes and mind focused deeply on these parameters, to working across industries like gaming, publishing, data storage, and being an entrepreneur, Deepak enlivens this conversation with lessons on innovation, leadership, customers, transitions, and much more. And that's perhaps given him a tremendous sense of perspective and a unique outlook. Listen especially to leadership nuggets towards the end, his defining moments, and if you're a Formula One fan, you can get to catch a super tidbit. And even otherwise, this one has something for everyone. Listen on. So good morning, Deepak. It's been a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this conversation. I am so happy to have you on the Software People Stories. A very warm welcome to you from all of us.
Good morning, Chitra. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad that we are actually doing this. I've been looking forward to it as well. So, this is great.
Thanks, Deepak. So we usually start by asking our guests to introduce themselves to our listeners. How would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, let me start with my name. I'm Deepak Visveswaraiah. I'm basically a native of Bangalore, born and brought up in Bangalore. And I've been in the industry for little over 3 decades, pretty much all of it in the software product development, domain. About 18 to 20 years of my tenure has been in the US, working for various companies in the US, and then about the last 15 years back, in Bangalore, in India here. Currently, I am the VP of Platform Engineering at Pega Systems. I joined the company very recently, just 3 months ago. Until recently, I was Senior Vice President and Managing Director at NetApp. We can talk more about that aspect of my journey over the recording. But I live with my wife here. My wife is an artist, and then we are empty nesters at this time. I have 2 kids who are both in college on the state side, a daughter and a son. And of course, we have a 5th person in the family, a Labrador Retriever named Buddy, who grew up with our kids. So that's a short introduction, if you will.
Thanks, Deepak. I guess it's Buddy and us at home now.
Pretty much, yes, it is Buddy and us at home. Yeah, we've been kind of, especially this year has been a little bit harder because the kids haven't been able to come home, given the pandemic situation and what have you. They've stayed put in the stateside. And although we talk regularly, it's still not the same as actually having them here. So, yeah.
I certainly hope as well. I know several of our listeners hoping that this time passes quickly and, we get to whatever that normal is soon enough. Where did this whole journey in the tech industry and product development and software start for you?
Oh, well, feels like a long time ago, right? An interesting question for me in the sense that when I was growing up, I did my engineering here in UVC in Bangalore, right? But before I got into engineering, as usually during that time, during that era, there were basically 2 things. If you were anywhere, reasonable in your studies, you actually just did 2 things. You either did engineering or you did medicine. My mother always wanted me to do medicine. And, in fact, I went and joined a medical college, during that time after my, plus two, after my PU. Very quickly, I realized it wasn't something that I wanted to do. And right after, just after a couple of days in the medical college, I came back and joined my engineering studies to complete my bachelor's, here in engineering. So that's kind of where it started. Although, funny enough that I did my engineering in mechanical engineering. And after I did my engineering, I incidentally came across this company called Kirloskar Computers here in Bangalore. And that's kind of where my IT journey started, because that's kind of where I started really programming. As much as we did some programming during our engineering courses in terms of learning Fortran and what have you, my practical journey really started there. I was there only for a couple of years, not even a couple of years, less than that, before I left to US to do my master's. Because I liked what I did at Kirloskar Computers from a programming point of view, that's kind of where my C programming really started. That's where I learned C programming. That's when I decided, okay, I needed to do a master's degree in computer science, and then, to get myself better. And then I went and did my master's in computer science from University of Texas. And, that's kind of when it all started. That's where the journey started, if you will.
What happened thereafter? Where did you start
Yeah.
out with your career in the US?
Well, right after my master's in computer science, I joined a company called AST International, which was a consulting company. We did a lot of work for nuclear power plants. It was an incredible eye-opener for me, if you will, in terms of being able to be in the thick of things, or being able to learn a couple of lessons really early on in my career, right? So being able to write software, being able to automate systems in nuclear power plants was something of an experience that I could never forget in my entire journey. I learned about being able to pay attention to detail. What does quality really mean when you do this? And then the fact that most of the clients were in Japan, that the nuclear power plants that we were working with were, was in Japan. Their work ethic and their attention to detail really taught me some things at that time that really held good for the rest of my life, right? That's kind of where my working journey really started. So I started in the nuclear energy sector, being able to write to do product development in that sector. From there, I went to, spend some time in semiconductors, about 5 years doing product development there. I spent some time in gaming, in a startup called Interactive Network on this, in the United States, where we developed gaming software. Then I worked for Adobe for about 4 years in desktop publishing. Then I also was a co-founder of a startup called FarmQuest in the Bay Area in the biotech industry. And then finally decided to kind of move back to Bangalore, more for family reasons than anything. And then the last 15 years I've spent predominantly in the IT storage infrastructure industry. So there has been a significant, transition in terms of domains, if you look at it. That has actually given me a solid understanding of how to transition between industries, or how to be able to adjust and be flexible to be able to perform in various domains. Through this journey, I also felt the need that I needed to get a better understanding of the business side. So while I was in the Bay Area, I also did my MBA in technology management, right? And that's kind of been my journey, from the starting point. And having been, I grew up as a developer, mainly on C and Unix, spent 10 years as an IC, decided to really move into the management ladder, and then that's when I kind of did my MBA as well, and started really, looking at more leadership roles across, my journey from there.
So many questions coming to my mind, Deepak. So many transitions, so many different domains. Starting out with mission critical, paying attention to detail, publishing, you seem to have done it all. So I guess we'll start with one question at a time. There's just a flood of them. So when you were going through these transitions, what were some of the key lessons or principles that you perhaps took away and have maybe held you in good stead from then to now?
Yeah, from that point of view, even though I might have changed domains, the way I always looked at it was that essentially I was still doing software product development, albeit it was for, different customers, a different customer segment. There may be different aspects of the product development from a technology stack point of view, what have you. But essentially the practices were more or less the same as you are developing enterprise grade software, that you go from one to the other. The curious thing for me was really about being able to learn a new market, learn a new domain, be able to interact with new, customers, being able to learn a little bit about that industry. That has always intrigued me, right? And that's really how it has helped me to be able to go through some of these transitions, from that point of view. Few things in terms of learning, going from one to another. One is, I've always believed in being able to invest, your time in being able to learn and be adaptable to the new domains. If you have a thirst for learning, if you have that hungriness, you're always looking for something new, looking for something to learn. And that has helped me a lot in terms of being able to learn new domains. The other thing was, as I talked about the attention to detail, right? In terms of, my first job in the nuclear energy sector, what have you, to be able to, the thought process of if you write 2 lines of code in a day, it better be the best 2 lines you wrote in your life until then kind of mindset. That level of attention to detail and the hungriness for learning helped me to be able to adapt to the new industry, to the new domains. I also learned a lot about, what we now call user experience from a desktop publishing point of view, the empathy from whom you are developing it for. Often as engineers, we always worry about, what is the best solution. We tend to kind of make it more complex. I learned the focus in terms of being able to simplify things. The focus on simplicity in trying to make it easy for who you're building and keeping in mind who you're building the software for is something that I also learned through that journey as well. The third thing is probably about, when you design for an enterprise product, you have to think about various things. For example, in gaming, performance was a big thing. We needed the games to be really performing well when, that was one of the bigger criteria for the users to be able to be consistent customers for us and what have you, right? So there's always been something that I have taken away from every part of that journey. The thing about whether it is about prioritization, attention to detail, the simplicity, the customer mindset, all of those are lessons that I've learned over that journey.
Thanks, Deepak. I certainly see a book in the making. I hope you do write one, because again, there are so many things to learn from your experience or even listen to you, perhaps. While I do have questions coming up in terms of convergence and prioritization and leadership level ambiguities that you faced, how did your transition to leadership happen? And personally, how did that affect any change in you, if it did at all? Was it a natural transition? I mean, I personally know you to be somebody who really enjoys and loves working with people, but I'm sure there must have been something that you went through as you transitioned to leadership roles. What are some of those that you can share with our listeners?
Yeah, I think the predominantly where it really started all was I was an individual contributor for the first 10 years of my life, and I really liked what I was doing, really focused in being able to learn technology, being able to be hands-on fully all the time. early on, I enjoyed really doing that. I think at a point in time when I came to a crossroads in terms of being able to make that decision, which way do I really want to grow in my career? One of the things, as I said, was I felt the need that I had to learn the business side of things. That's when I decided to actually go do my MBA. After I did my MBA, I also wanted to, I kind of wanted to sit back and think through in terms of what do I want to do, with my career, which way do I want to take? And as you have rightly noticed, and then as you talked about, I am somebody who wants to work with people, who is in the middle of things, walking the floors, talking to my teammates, talking to colleagues, and then being able to engage in conversations that could potentially trigger ideas. And I'm a big believer in driving innovation. I'm pretty passionate about wherever I am and then whatever I'm responsible for or my teams are responsible for, how do we really drive value and innovation, right? I mean, and that goes a lot by collaborating. And I've always been big on that. So I thought, for me to be able to flourish, perhaps I could be better I could do better in a management role, in a leadership role, and really started following that path from that point on. Having said that, in hindsight, a lot of the times I'm still I like the technology a lot. I still try and keep up with things. I still engage with all of our teams in terms of design and architecture reviews and get to, keep up with it and discuss that. I like that part a lot. But having said that, I chose this path more really in terms of being able to flourish from the perspective of working with people, perspective of driving innovation, and have like the leadership aspects of things over time. And that's kind of where my journey started, more on the leadership side, on the management side, if you will.
That is really interesting. And in fact, when you talk about innovation, you've worked in, product companies and in product development most of your life. And even while we were colleagues at NetApp, I know that innovation was one of the big survival challenges for any product company.
Yes.
So when you talk about value and driving innovation through collaboration, how easy or difficult has it been to bring about convergence and prioritization? Perhaps what have been your experiences and what have you done to bring that about?
The thing that you talked about in terms of both innovation and prioritization, right? Or a couple of key things that I learned early on in my time. In fact, a story to share about prioritization, I got my early, insight into prioritization, or sometimes I call that, my product management 101, with my father. When I was studying for one of those engineering exams, I was studying for exams, and then at that time I had this habit of being able to study with music on. And this was during my engineering days. And then one of the days my father walked into the room and told me in terms of, you need to decide which way you want to go. You either really want to focus on music and do something really good about that, or you really want to focus on your engineering exams that you're trying to study for and do well in that. I don't see how you can, doing a mediocre job of, both of these is not really going to help you, kind of thing. I mean, that was an incredible insight for me. And even till today, I believe that has actually stayed with me, for all my life. I keep telling my teams or people I meet that doing a few things insanely well is so much better for everyone, for the companies, for the individuals, for the teams, rather than doing a mediocre job of 10 different things, right? So that lesson has been a fantastic lesson for me, thanks to my father. In terms of talking about innovation and being able to drive value, I think, one of the aspects of moving back to India is kind of what enabled me to even drive this further. Being able to do it, in India, for that matter, right? With all of the global in-house centers, a couple of the companies I've worked for in the last 15 years, the idea of being able to drive innovation is where you can provide value for your company from a future perspective. You actually look at the future and you design for the future. This gives a lot more capability for people to become visionaries, and it allows people to be able to take risks. I think that is another big part of it that people learn as we try and innovate more, is that it gives the ability to pay, for people to take risks and also to fail fast. If we have that culture and build that culture, you don't have to be worried about failing. You fail, you get up, you run, you go to another idea, while you're doing that. Often enough, what I've also observed is that people get completely embroiled in the tactical part of the work. There are always things that you need to work on a release. There are always things that you need to, address customer issues. There are things that the day-to-day operational stuff that one needs to worry as a manager, as a leader of a team, or even as a member of the team who's working on things. You end up spending a significant time in being able to address the tactical aspects of things, right? I think you have to consciously balance that with the strategic aspect of your roles. You have to think long term when you think about innovation. You have to think broader, than just your role, and being able to do that, and the ability to take risks, and having the capability to do that helps to be able to drive innovation in my perspective, right? Couple of other things very important from an innovation point of view in my in my books is one, having the right team to be able to innovate. You could probably do with one or two heroes in the group, but I would always have a talented team to be able to drive such innovation within a company. When I talk about a team, it really requires the senior technical talent. So that's one of the things I typically focus on, is to be able to build a solid senior technical talent in your organization to be able to innovate, and really have that customer perspective, and understand, what are you innovating for? Who are you innovating for? And why are you actually doing this? Does this make really a business sense in being able to do it? Think things like that. That's kind of been my passion, whether it is drive innovation internally within your organization, whether it is advising startups or helping the startups and build an ecosystem within the country. That kind of leadership is really something that I've been passionate about.
Thanks, Deepak. And in fact, I'm trying to see how best I can club two questions here. You talked about, innovation through the eyes of the company adding value to the business. And you talked about customers. And having seen you and worked with you, this was a question I wish I had asked you or spoken to you more about. You were always talking to customers. You were visiting them. You were sitting across the table from them and bringing back so many insights. What have been some of the key things that you've done to establish and develop those relationships with customers to get to really understanding what's the core of their problem, and then bringing it back and translating it to the engineers, and so you can actually address their needs? What has that experience been like?
That is one part of, I think, leadership that people to recognize the need to meet with customers. Unless you do that, you're so internally focused that you will actually miss the mark in terms of what is that. That's what customer empathy is all about. If you want to really understand what is in customers' mind, I think the most important thing that I did was listen. Half the time when you actually go to customers, what they want you to do is to listen to them. Number one is really about being able to listen and understand their problem. They're actually giving you a huge gift in terms of giving the feedback about how your product is doing, what some of their challenges are. And they're looking at you as an advisor, because they know that you're actually talking to multiple customers. You're actually talking to, other customers of similar nature, perhaps, that, whether it is in their same domain, whether it is their competitors, whether it is, although they don't expect you to share particular details of, what your experience may be with a competitor or somebody else in the industry, they also expect your advice in terms of what is the best way to use your products, what is what does the community data tell you? If there are 10 customers using it in a particular way and they're taking advantage of it, and if there is a 11th customer who is really having a problem using your software or using your products, you can actually share with them, here is what I've learned from talking to 10 customers. And often enough, they're very, very receptive in being able to understand the best practices, in being able to hear that advice, right? So a lot of that is come back to, I kind of bring that back to the teams and then talk about that with the teams, in the hope of a couple of things. One, it gives them a perspective of how customers are using and what some of the challenges are, and how do we design our products better, and how do we build our products better. The second thing is really give them a insight into why should they be talking to customers. What is it that they could actually gain? What is it that how can they get that customer empathy directly? I learned a very hard lesson early on in my life when I was a co-founder of a startup in the United States. We developed the software in the healthcare industry, and I'm not a healthcare person by any means, right? I'm not the expert healthcare. Of course, in the founding, with the co-founders, we had one of the experts in the healthcare industry. Even then, in fact, this was one thing I probably look at as a failure or a mistake that I made early on, and then what I learned from it. This is kind of where I learned really all about customer empathy, or really understanding the customer perspective. We designed the first version of the software product that we wanted to release to the market. And because we were a startup, we were always, of course, bootstrapped and strapped for resources, and trying to get the product as quickly into the market as possible. We went about building the product the way we thought customers would like it. And we recruited a set of customers to be able to, share that version before we went into the market. And then when we presented and when we demoed the product to the users, although we had talked to some of the executives in the industry, in the biotech industry, we hadn't really envisaged or really had spent time with the specific type of users, for that software product. And when we first, showed that to the set of users, they were all very happy with the idea. They were all very happy with what we were addressing. They were all very happy with, the work that was being done or what have you. But it, really didn't serve the way they used to do things. They ended up having to change their processes. They ended up having to, they would have had to change their processes. They would have had to change their way of working in order to use a product that we developed. And when we can't expect a large corporation to be able to change the way they do things just because we want them to use our product, and especially a small startup that is coming out with a brand new product to be able to help them, right? That's that's an early on lesson for me in terms of customer perspective, to be able to focus and understand the users and what processes are they using, how do they work really day in and day out, really understand their patterns, understand their processes, understand their best practices, and then be able to really design your product from that perspective rather than what is the best engineered product. That's kind of was a huge lesson for me. Some of the very large customers I've learned a lot from them in terms of the scale of the products that you end up having to develop and things like that. For example, whether it is large financial, like for example, in India, I worked very closely with a large financial institution, the largest financial institution in India for that matter. Their ability to be able to deal with the scale of a country like India is unbelievable. Having 50,000 plus ATMs or 100 plus million accounts and what have you. The idea is to be able to establish relationship with executives at such corporations that you can get insights on what are their visions, where are they driving, and how do you help by innovating, how can you help them achieve some of their vision right within their own organizations. And that is what I've been able to do over time, being able to spend time with customers and kind of bringing that value back to the corporations.
Thank you so much, Deepak. Such a wealth of information out there. In fact, two questions coming up to my mind. One based off of what you just said was establishing relationship with those key executives and decision makers. So question one there is, what point in time in that relationship do you know that you have their attention and they're probably saying, okay to you, I'll go with you, I'll listen to you. You started out by saying that, yes, listening and understanding what they have is so
Yes.
key. And I'm thinking at some point in time in that relationship, it becomes, okay, let's walk this road together. How does that happen and how do you sense it? I mean, as a leader, and probably a lesson that's so important for startups, so many of us, otherwise it always seems to appear that we're working at cross purposes. So how do you sense that, and how do you know that you have that person's attention?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way I have always approached it, Chitra, is, number one is, as we talked about listening part, right? We already talked about it. I think the number two is you are actually walking into those meetings, or you're walking into the customer's meeting with the mindset of you're establishing a relationship. You're not actually there to sell something. The way I have always established relationships is that I am not here to sell you my product. I'm here to establish a relationship. I'm here to be able to understand your perspectives. I'm here to be able to listen to you to start with, right? And what happens when you actually have a little bit of those conversations over time, what people will recognize you for is that you're not just there to make a transaction and walk away. You're there for the longer term. And when you recognize that, where is the tipping point is when somebody like that calls you to, for some advice. Customer executives called me and says in terms of, hey, Deepak, I'm actually thinking through this. I want to bounce this off of you because you're in this domain, you understand this industry. What do you think we should do? What would be your advice? That is when you actually have hit the mark in terms of being able to establish that relationship, being able to get to the point where you're not in it for a transaction, you're actually in it for a longer term relationship. There are times where you need to go above and beyond to be able to help a customer. That's another way to be able to earn their trust and respect. If a customer is in trouble, in fact, in one of the companies that I worked for, a company, a customer that I was in touch with was affected by one of the natural calamities that happened in the U.S. Their data center got flooded and a lot of their equipment got damaged in that. And the company I worked for, we shipped equipment overnight, to the extent that there were some people in the organization who drove their own personal cars, with things in it to be able to help the customer get up and running. Those are kind of the stories that they will probably never ever forget in their life, right? In terms of how a company actually helped them get back up and running. The essence of the story that I'm basically sharing is that long-term view in building that relationship, being able to listen, to them and understand their problems. And then when they start really asking you for advice, asking you for your expertise, asking you for your ideas in how they design their infrastructure or how they go about making their decisions, how they can understand some of the best practices that we see in our customer footprint, customer base as such, or the science that you have established that great relationship.
And when you say long-term view to building relationships, I also noticed that in my career is that any product has its own time, to whether it's to build, to accept, to deploy, for people to use, and so on. And one question that's coming to my mind is, in today's world where everybody wants everything jhatpat, I want it
Yes.
here, I want it now, I want to see the results now. And time and again, this is a conflict that perhaps I've battled with internally, is how do you tell people, hey, just stay there for a while, just wait, allow this to unfurl, whether it's a deployment, whether it's usage, whether it's getting the feel or experience of a product. And like you said, nurturing a relationship to the point where, hey, then you're becoming somebody's confidant and trusted advisor and all of that.
Yes.
So as a leader, how do you sort of balance these urgencies and the need for, maybe to use a cliched phrase, instant gratification?
That's a great question, Chitra, because I think we do as leaders need to separate these two things out. The sense of urgency versus instant gratification have to be separated out. The sense of urgency has to be there in an organization. You can't be, we always used to hear from our grandmothers and grandfathers about this, hare and tortoise story, right? In terms of being slow and methodical could win the race, kind of thing. We can't be there with the mindset, with the kind of transformations that are going on in the industry, especially in the last few years, the pace at which things are moving. You can't say, I'm going to be slow and steady and I'm going to win the race. That's not going to happen. In fact, I use one of the quotes from a race car driver, Mario Andretti, where he actually says, if you see everything clear in front of you, you're just not moving fast enough. Right. So it's got to be blur in front of you. That's how fast you got to be moving. But that doesn't necessarily mean you don't value longer term. You don't value that vision. You don't build those relationships over time, because, what you're doing in terms of the transformations or the changes or your sense of urgency comes from that, being able to move from one to another as quickly as possible, because you're moving on that curve of innovation, because you're actually moving on that path of making improvements and making life better for your customers. I think it is incredibly important to be able to make that distinction. Some of the product leaders often think about, I want to build the perfect product to be able to take it to market, right? Just the same quote that I shared from Mario Andretti, very, analogous to that is in the product world, we often say, if you're not embarrassed by your first version of the product, then you actually release that product too late into the market, right? So it's about, right. So it's about being able to prioritize and doing a few things well, right? In terms of how do you make sure you're addressing the top priority use cases that you're designing the product for, and how are you looking at that longer term relationships or the vision or the view that we talked about. It's incredibly important to really separate that sense of urgency. You do want the sense of urgency in what you do, but not necessarily in terms of letting things go from a relationship point of view, from a vision point of view, from your own career development point of view, or what have you. Those things need clear delineation.
In a very interesting point of view, and I'm certainly going to take away the whole blurry vision thing in a very different perspective, thanks to this. If you were to share any defining moments in your career, especially in your leadership role, what would that be? And what are some of the messages that you would like to leave aspiring leaders with, or even people currently in a leadership role?
Defining moments, it's so hard to pick a couple, Chitra, but things that come to my mind right away is, when I was able to, the corporations are always trying to become global companies. All of the large corporations know that they need the talent that is available worldwide. They need distributed engineering. They need access to market. But even then, if you look at the industry, especially in the large enterprise industry that have this globalized setup, and the global in-house centers in India, predominantly the decisions were driven out of the headquarters or out of the US to a large extent. And of course, things have been changing. I think one of the defining moments for me was when it was announced that I had a global role that I played sitting out of Bangalore. It kind of proved a point in terms of, it does not matter where a leader actually is located from a geographical perspective. As long as they are capable, they can actually have teams reporting to them from wherever, including the state side. When in the last decade or so, I've always had teams that were outside of India, including the United States, reporting to me directly, and then be able to play those global roles, as long as you don't use any of the excuses to come into being able to play that role. I think it was a great thing in my life to be able to prove that as a first in the organization that I worked for. There was also a moment when I was announced as the senior vice president outside of the US. I was the first senior VP in the company outside of the US in the product engineering area, which was another defining moment for me. And then I thought it also showed an example that these things actually can be done irrespective of where you're located. Right. Another moment that I can never probably forget is, my mother being at the graduation, from my MBA. She had actually come to the US at that point in time, and it was wonderful to really have her sitting there during my graduation, ceremony when I finished my MBA. Right. So these are some things that that you can never forget, that make you as a person. Hopefully there are some things that I can share as defining moments. A couple of things I will probably repeat, from what I said earlier. I would say in terms of, do a few things insanely well versus, doing a mediocre job of a number of things. That's number one. Number two is prioritize. If you don't prioritize, you will spend so much time on your tactical side of things that you will just always, all your time will go away there. So balance your strategic thinking, strategic aspects of the job versus the tactical stuff intentionally. Make that time and balance that by prioritizing things. That's another thing. Third would be, make sure that you develop your network. You don't necessarily have to be an extrovert to develop your network. You can still be an introvert and still develop a network. Often enough, people put that together and then they think, oh, I don't necessarily, I'm not great in terms of talking to people, so I don't, enjoy developing that network. But it is important as a leader to be able to develop your network, whether an introvert, there are several introverts who have been great CEOs for that matter. So developing that network of mentors, coaches and, colleagues that you can actually bounce things off of and talk to people about ideas and then what have you, because is a great weapon to have. The fourth one I would say is you want to be an ideal team player. You should be an ideal team player and also hire ideal team players as somebody that you would want to bring into your team. I was recently reading a book written by Patrick Lancioni. It's called The Ideal Team Player. He talks about 3 traits of a person in being able to hire this ideal team player. Right, the 3 traits that you look for in people are people being humble, being hungry for doing things, and then being people smart. Not necessarily that you have to have a high IQ. It's really about knowing what to say where, knowing how to deal with people, being people smart, not necessarily IQ smart per se. Those are the 3 traits that I look for, when I'm building a team. The way I look at it is that you want to build a team that is going to be successful consistently, not a one-time thing. So if you look at teams that win championships, if you look at, a Chicago Bulls, team led by Michael Jordan, yes, he could often win games, single-handedly. But you know what? If he needed a team to be able to win the championships consistently over time. I think that actually is a great example of being building a team that can consistently win. Lastly, I would also say, try to be the best at whatever you do. And I try to look at everything as an opportunity. Having a customer perspective, knowing what you're building, why you're building, look at all of those things as opportunities and be the best at whatever you do. And lastly, if you're not having fun doing what you're doing, then you're probably in the wrong job. To me, enjoying what you're doing is immensely important. And then if you're not enjoying it, then you're probably in the wrong job. I would actually suggest go find your passion and do the right thing and enjoy what you do, because you do it for a long time in your life. And then, it makes it so much more easier and enjoyable. So that's what I would probably tell people.
Thanks, Deepak. I think a fabulous way to round out this conversation, and I would certainly look forward to many, many more. I think being in the role of a guest on a podcast has simply brought up so many more questions that would love to probably have with you at some point in time, and I hope we can. So thank you so much for your time.
Uh,
And this has been a fantastic conversation.
Absolutely, Chitra. I've enjoyed it every bit. This has been wonderful. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of your Software People podcast series. And you guys are doing a wonderful job in putting these things together. And I hope it actually helps a lot of people, right? And that's the end goal. And for people who are, whether they're coming into the IT industry now, or people who have been there, even if they can take one piece of learning from a podcast, I think you guys, it's well worth your time. You guys are doing a great job. So congratulations on that. And thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
We thank Siddharth for the music and Malavika for promoting the Software People stories.
If you like this episode,
Please subscribe on your favorite podcast client.
And spread the word in your network.
if you'd like to share your story,
Contact us at podcasts@pm-powerconsulting.com.